This is Dateline News and Conversation. I've got a very important and interesting show tonight and a very important guest. She's been on the show before. She's a former CIA analyst who was in charge of the Middle Eastern desk, I guess as they called it, in the CIA. So she's got some very interesting things to say about what happened after 9/11. What I'm going to do is I'm going to show the full version of a speech she gave on 9/11 in Washington, D.C. at the Quaker Friends Meeting House. She and I will talk a little bit introducing that clip, and at the end of that clip, we'll have some conversation about the significance of it. So, Elizabeth, welcome back to the show.
Thank you, Regis. It's good to be here with you.
Always. Elizabeth, give an introduction to this speech that you gave on 9/11. Explain who was there, what the meeting was about, etc. And then we will roll that clip of you giving that speech.
Okay, so as Regis said, I was the Deputy National Intelligence Officer for the Near East in the National Intelligence Council at the end of my career. And I did work on Middle Eastern media and political issues throughout the 27-year span of my time in the agency. I do want to say up front that as soon as I left, I became a peace activist and have been involved in various issues since then. But the event was called Turning the Tide, and I was really honored when I was asked to participate and just sort of tell my story. I do want to say up front that the applause I received at the end of my speech should go to Ed Curtin, whose essay on 9/11 inspired me very much, and who very generously gave me permission to draw as little or as much from his speech as I wished. But the audience were mainly 9/11 supporters. And of course, it was live streamed by a show called Redacted. So it actually had global reach. And I think many, many more people watched it from the live stream than were actually in the meeting house itself.
Yeah, and I want to explain Redacted is a show created by Clayton Morris and his wife. And he, as you indicated, offered to live stream all 3 days of this conference. And all of those recordings can be found on YouTube. So, Elizabeth, you were one of, I don't know how many people. There were 3 days of this event. They ranged from architects, engineers, firemen, witnesses, policemen who were present on 9/11 when the buildings came down. And then they had people like yourself and a fellow CIA colleague, John Kiriakou, also gave an incredibly powerful speech at the very end of this conference. And now let's watch the clip of Elizabeth Murray giving her speech on 9/11.
My name is Elizabeth Murray. I was a CIA political and military analyst for 27 years. After that, I retired and immediately went into the peace movement. I went into nuclear resistance at the Ground Zero Center for Nonviolent Action. And that's all I've done is work on peace. And I'm also active on the Gaza issue and a number of other issues. I also want to say that I'm so honored to be among this distinguished audience and very distinguished speakers. So thank you all for coming. It's really a pleasure to be among you. On September the 11th, 2001, I was inside CIA headquarters at Langley, Virginia. I happened to be on a rotational assignment to the National Intelligence Officer for Warning on the second floor. And I was called over that morning to look at the television, and I was there when the second plane, or apparently a second plane, hit one of the World Trade Center towers. So we later learned that morning that the Pentagon had been hit. And you can just imagine what my colleagues and I were thinking in terms of which building was probably next on the list to be hit. So the nerves were running high. And our boss then told us that there was going to be an evacuation of our building, which gave me considerable relief until I learned that, well, what was I thinking? Just because I was on the second floor didn't mean I would be out soon. Of course, the evacuation started from the seventh floor, which is, of course, where the CIA director's office is and all the big mucky mucks. So it seemed like an eternity before finally it was our turn to very, very slowly get out. And of course, like everyone else that day, our heads and eyes were turned skyward, looking for flying objects heading in our direction. So it was quite the day, and I'm sure many of you went through something similar. So that was where I was on that day. A colleague of mine knew that the roads were going to be very, very jammed that day with everyone going home. So he suggested we meet at a local pub called McKeever's, which is in McLean. It's just down the road from Langley, and it's a very well-known CIA spook hangout. So we went to McKeever's, and of course, every single television station was playing on a continuous loop, this destruction of the towers. And you can imagine viewing that over and over again, combined with copious numbers of alcoholic drinks. And plus the trauma and shock of feeling like you just narrowly escaped being one of the victims. You can imagine how that was frying everyone's brains. So it was just a really bizarre afternoon. And I recall something that Graham McQueen said in one of his presentations, and I quote, "If you are an uncritical flag waver, then you can be manipulated into anything." And I mention that just because I wanted to say a little anecdote. Right after 9/11, I had scheduled already a trip to Rehoboth Beach. And I remember on my drive there, every single home had an American flag outside, and more than one usually. And there were also stickers that said "United" and everywhere. And of course, there was almost instantaneous hatred for anyone who even looked Middle Eastern or Muslim. And of course, as you know, lots and lots of innocent people were rounded up very quickly. Anyone, that Sikhs with turbans, and anyone that sort of was a different color than Caucasian was immediately guilty. So it was really a frightful time in this country, filled with very strange symbols and almost universally strange behavior. And I remember wondering to myself, what is happening to our country? And inside the agency, I saw that transformation. It was very disturbing. Very quickly, everything became very militarized. The atmosphere was very pro-torture. If you expressed even the slightest bit of dissent about what was happening at Guantanamo or what was happening in Abu Ghraib, people thought you were unpatriotic or even a traitor. It wasn't long before I started seeing bumper stickers on the back of cars in the CIA parking lot that said "terrorist hunting license." This was the sort of atmosphere that I was forced to work in. And suddenly, Fox News was blaring all the time, even in offices as you were trying to get work done. And I think people noticed that I wasn't with the program. And so I was immediately, or not immediately, actually, it was later on, I was banished to the back of the office and given sort of very menial jobs, because at the time, if you dared raise your voice about anything. People wondered, what about your loyalty to the country. So I really feel like all these symbols and all these continuous bombardment of this event over and over again was purposeful invocations of triggering events and triggering thoughts. And also they were controlling our minds through the language they used. And with all good propaganda, this language had to be introduced gradually over time and repeated over and over again. And as you know, this was all carried out by the corporate mainstream media. So most of you know this, but I will just list a few of these words, trigger words, that help to sort of solidify in people's minds the false claims about the 9/11 attack. Pearl Harbor, of course, was one of them. And as pointed out by David Ray Griffin and others, the term was used in September 2000 in the Project for the New American Century report, Rebuilding America's Defenses. Its neocon authors argued that the U.S. would not be able to attack Iraq, Afghanistan, Syria, Lebanon, Libya, Iran, Somalia, Sudan, etc., absent some catastrophic and catalyzing event like a new Pearl Harbor. Coincidentally or not, the film Pearl Harbor, made with Pentagon assistance, was released on May 25, 2001, and was a box office hit. It was in theaters throughout the summer. The thought of an attack on Pearl Harbor, not a surprise to the U.S. government, but presented as such back in the day, was in the air, despite the fact that the 60th anniversary of that attack was not until December 7th, 2001, a more likely release date. But once the September 11th attacks occurred, the Pearl Harbor comparison was plucked out of the social atmosphere and used innumerable times. Even George W. Bush was reported to have had the time to allegedly use it in his diary that night. And the word homeland, the strange un-American term homeland, another World War II word associated with Nazi Germany, was also used many times by the neocon authors of Rebuilding America's Defenses. I doubt any average American used this term before 9/11. Of course, it became the moniker and part of the name of the Department of Homeland Security, marrying home with security to form a comforting name that simultaneously and unconsciously suggests a defense against Hitler-like evil coming from the outside. Not coincidentally, Hitler introduced the word homeland into Nazi propaganda vernacular at the 1934 Nuremberg rally. Both usages conjure up images of a home besieged by alien forces intent on its destruction. Thus, preemptive action was necessary. Ground zero. This is a third World War II, the good war term, first used at 11:55 a.m. on September 11th by Mark Walsh, aka the Harley guy, because he was wearing a Harley Davidson t-shirt, in an interview on the street by Fox News reporter Rick Leventhal, who was identified as a freelancer. Walsh also explains the Twin Towers collapse in a precise, well-rehearsed manner that would be given the same illogical explanation later given by the government, mostly due to structural failure because the fire was too intense. Ground zero, a nuclear bomb term first used by U.S. scientists to refer to the spot where they exploded the first nuclear bomb in New Mexico in 1945, became another trigger word adopted by the media that suggested that a nuclear attack had occurred or might in the future if the U.S. didn't take action. And of course, we all remember what Condoleezza Rice stated on September the 5th, 2002, the following year, quote, "We don't want the smoking gun to become a mushroom cloud." So this, again, is just further examples of how they were playing with the minds of the American public and triggering past traumas and not letting them die. So you can imagine what this was doing in terms of, banishing any doubts in the minds of most Americans. So the nuclear scare was raised again by the administration, and conjoining the term nuclear with ground zeros served to raise the fear factor dramatically. Ironically, the project to develop the nuclear bomb was called the Manhattan Project and headquartered at 270 Broadway in New York, just a few short blocks north of the World Trade Center. The unthinkable. This is another nuclear term whose usage as a linguistic mind control and propaganda is analyzed by Graham McQueen in the penultimate chapter of the 2001 Anthrax Deception. He notes the patterned use of this term before and after September 11th, while stating that the pattern may not signify a grand plan. It deserves investigation and contemplation. He then presents a convincing case that the use of this term couldn't be accidental. He notes how George W. Bush, in a major foreign policy speech on May the 1st, 2001, quote, gave informal public notice that the United States intended to withdraw unilaterally from the ABM treaty. Bush said the U.S. must be willing to rethink the unthinkable. This was necessary because of terrorism and rogue states with weapons of mass destruction. The project for the New American Century paper also had argued that the U.S. withdraw from the ABM treaty. Right. So once the September 11th attacks occurred, Bush rethought the unthinkable and officially gave formal notice on December 13th to withdraw the United States from the ABM treaty. Graham McQueen specifies the many times different media used the term unthinkable in October 2001 in reference to the anthrax attacks. He explicates its usage in one of the anthrax letters, the unthinkable. He explains how the media that used the term so often were at the time unaware of its usage in the anthrax letter, since that letter's content had not yet been revealed, and how the letter writer had mailed the letter before the media started using the word. He makes a rock-solid case showing the U.S. government's complicity in the anthrax attacks, and therefore in those of September 11th. I am reminded of Orwell's point in 1984, again, a reference to the unthinkable, a heretical thought, that is, a thought diverging from the principles of Ingsoc, should be literally unthinkable, at least as far as thought is dependent on words, end quote. And then just the term 9/11. This is a key term because, we all know what number we dial for emergencies, 911. The Iraq War promoter, Bill Keller, who at the time was the future editor of the New York Times, wrote an op-ed piece in the Times called America's Emergency Line, 9/11. The linkage of the attacks to a permanent national emergency was thus subliminally introduced, as Keller mentioned Israel 9 times and 7 times compared the U.S. situation to that of Israel as a target for terrorists. The first sentence of his op-ed reads, quote, an Israeli response to America's aptly dated wake-up call might well be, now you know. By referring to September the 11th as 9/11, an endless national emergency became wed to an endless war on terror aimed at preventing Hitler-like terrorists from obliterating us with nuclear weapons that could create another ground zero or Holocaust. It is a term that pushes all the right buttons, evoking unending social fear and anxiety. It is language as sorcery and sophistry. It is propaganda at its best. Even those who dissent from the official narrative continue to use the term that has become a fixture of public consciousness through endless repetition. As George W. Bush would later put it, as he connected Saddam Hussein to 9/11 and pushed for the Iraq War, we don't want the smoking gun to be a mushroom cloud. So in other words, all of this were ingredients for the perfect linguistic mind control cocktail for the American people. So we really shouldn't speak of 9/11 because we're using these propaganda, it's a propaganda term. We should just refer to it as the attacks of September 11th and not play into this. But, you know, the damage has already been done to the American public, and it may take a lifetime to undo it. Lance DeHaven Smith puts it well in Conspiracy Theory in America. The rapidity with which the new language of the war on terror appeared and took hold, the synergy between terms and their mutual connections to World War II nomenclatures, and above all, the connection between many terms and the emergency motif of 9/11 and 9/11. Any one of these factors alone, but certainly all of them together, raise the possibility that work on this linguistic construct began long before 9/11. It turns out that elite political crime, even treason, may actually be official policy. Now, of course, we don't really need to say may be official policy. Some of us know that it's a little bit more certain than that by now. So the evidence for linguistic mind control does not stand alone, of course. It underpins the actual attacks of September 11th and the subsequent anthrax attacks that are linked to this. The official explanations for these events by themselves do not stand up to elementary logic and are patently false, as proven by thousands of well-respected professional researchers from all walks of life, engineers, pilots, architects, and scholars from many disciplines. To paraphrase the prescient Philadelphia lawyer Vince Salandria, who said it long ago concerning the assassination of President John F. Kennedy, the attacks of 2001 are a false mystery concealing state crimes. And I have to thank Barbara Honegger for being here because I'm going to give you a quote from my former boss back when I joined the agency in 1983. His name was William Casey. And he famously said, "We'll know our disinformation campaign is complete when everything the American public believes is false." And the source of that quote, the primary person in the room source, is Barbara Honegger. Thank you, Barbara. That is how we know, thanks to Barbara Honegger, that that quote is true. So if the director, the late director of the CIA actually says openly, or maybe not so openly, that he wants there to be a disinformation campaign to fool the American people and pull the rug over our eyes, then it's not a secret anymore, is it? So, and I also just want to make a comment after that, saying that I see I have 11 minutes left, so I actually have a chance to tell you another anecdote. But I want to conclude this section by giving you my personal opinion about 9/11 truth. It's my belief that if we can open our nation's eyes to the truth about 9/11, then the lies behind the assassinations of President John F. Kennedy, his brother Robert F. Kennedy, Martin Luther King, and Malcolm X will have been exposed, as the same forces were behind those assassinations as well. So that's why this is so important. Now, of course, I lost my papers, but I'll tell you the anecdote off the top of my head. Let's fast forward a few years after 9/11. I was in charge of Iraqi media at the CIA's open source arm, formerly known as the Foreign Broadcast Information Service, now known as the Open Source Center. But one morning, yes, 10 minutes, I promised to honor that. One morning, I received a call from the office of then Deputy Defense Secretary Paul Wolfowitz. And this was in early March, or actually maybe late February, early March of 2003, shortly before the US went to war in Iraq. And the question, or the request, the tasking from Wolfowitz's office was for me to find confirmation in the Iraqi media of a link and even a meeting between Saddam Hussein and Al-Qaeda. So I was able to contact our office in the Middle East and have them go through everything, scour all the media to find any evidence of any kind of contact or meeting. And they did a very thorough job, and there was nothing. And so I went back and confirmed that it was, the answer was negative. Well, the next week, I got another call from the same office, and they had the same request. And I thought, well, maybe I'm missing something. So I did my due diligence and I had them go and look again. And again, the answer came back no. And when Wolfowitz's office called a third time 2 weeks later, it suddenly hit me that I was just not replying with the proper answer. And they were looking for political, any kind of reasons to sell the Iraq War to the American people. And they desperately needed 9/11 and its bogeyman, Osama bin Laden and Al-Qaeda, to be linked together with Iraq to justify that war. And of course, it never happened. And finally, and just kind of the epilogue to this incident was, finally, in frustration, I called Wolfowitz's office and I said, can you please give me the source of this information? It will help me maybe find the answer. And of course, I never heard back from the office. They never called back. And that's just an example, maybe the tip of the iceberg of the type of politicization of intelligence and just shaming of analysts who were trying to do their jobs. And I later learned that interrogators who were interrogating so-called terrorists in various places like Iraq and Afghanistan and elsewhere, they were shamed for they had been tasked with finding the same link. And the common feeling inside the agency was, oh, they're simply not torturing them enough. It was really, really disturbing whenever I would raise questions about, how things were being done. And it was this terrible brainwashing. So what was done, and I would say that the CIA was like a microcosm of the United States. All the brainwashing that was happening to the American people was also happening. And the ugly irony, of course, was that, the elites of the CIA knew darn well what they were doing. And so I appreciate all the work that everyone here is doing. And there should really be a lot of righteous anger for what our government did to us. Thank you very much.
Well, Elizabeth, that was quite a speech. I was very moved by it. And I have to think that the people that were there at the Quaker Meeting House, but possibly the thousands or tens of thousands more who saw it live, or most likely even the recorded version if they weren't present and available for the live telecast. It's very important, I think, for people to see that. Now, I have a couple of questions, Elizabeth. What was the purpose of this conference?
I think the purpose of this conference was a strong effort to get the 9/11 issue out in front of the American people. I think if our government had its way, people would kind of forget about it. The deceptions around 9/11, the overwhelming evidence presented about how these buildings were likely downed in controlled explosions, all for the purpose of selling to the American people, going to war in Afghanistan, in Iraq, all laid out by the project of the new American century, the neocon blueprint for attacking and dominating 7 countries in the Middle East. There was a huge agenda behind this. And the purpose of this conference was to place this overwhelming evidence in front of the American people, many of whom have had doubts and suspicions. But because it is such a terrible deception by our government, many people just don't want to go there, Regis.
Well, there you go. You said it. What even Richard Gage and some others don't want to say, an incredible deception event by the government of the United States of America. The purpose was to try to get all of this information out again in front of the public. But wasn't it also to kind of rally support for a new investigation of 9/11 that will expose the lies of the 9/11 Commission?
Absolutely, Regis. That was another major point, reason for this conference, and I'm glad you brought that up. And the more people are sort of exposed, the more that people are exposed to the truth and the facts, hopefully we can build up some more political pressure. It was very moving to listen to the testimony of people who were there, the testimony of firemen. We watched some videos of what they had to say, the ones that heard the pop, pop, pop of controlled demolition explosions there. And many people have made the comment during this conference that, and if you travel abroad and talk to anyone about their opinion about 9/11, taxi drivers, ordinary people in the streets say, of course it was an inside job. And I think it's harder for Americans, with this, it's almost like a dysfunctional family where no one wants to admit that perhaps the head of the household is abusing members of the family. And for the sake of keeping the family together, people remain silent. And actually, I was told that many psychologists have actually likened the American cognitive dissonance over 9/11 to a dysfunctional family.
Yeah, well, I'm going to go way back, at least to the time of the assassination of John F. Kennedy in our lifetime. And then soon after his assassination, they got his brother, Bobby Kennedy, RFK, and then they got Martin Luther King and Malcolm X. And there have been any number of other political assassinations that have taken place in the years since that have never been explained. Now, Elizabeth, going back to the assassination of President John F. Kennedy in November of 1963, this was a traumatic event for American people. Everybody who was alive then remembers exactly where they were, what time of day it was, who was with them, and then the next 2 or 3 days that ensued. And then we fast forward to 9/11. 9/11, in my opinion, was as equally traumatic for the American people as was the assassination of John Kennedy. We were told immediately that we were being attacked by Arab terrorists. And this instilled fear, and a different kind of fear in the American people than was instilled during the assassinations we just mentioned of John Kennedy, Robert Kennedy, Martin Luther King. This was a fear that these Arabs who hate us because of our freedoms, were attacking us now in our own country. And as you mentioned, and you mentioned in the clip that we just watched, this was designed as a new Pearl Harbor for America to immediately claim that there was now a new war on terror. And Elizabeth, that war on terror continues today. What are your thoughts on this?
Yeah, I think I totally agree with everything you just said, Regis, and I think it was literally a form of MK Ultra mind control on the American people. I think this has gone on since the assassination of John F. Kennedy, and I think it's just so easy for our government and the government controlled media to to insert into the media these lies while Americans were so traumatized in the wake of 9/11. Yes, bin Laden did it, and these images are true. And then in the wake of 9/11, I remember almost instantaneously, there was not only this symbolic language that I talked about in my speech, inspired by uh, or literally taken from Ed Curtin's essay, but also I remember that these 9/11 license plates almost making an icon, a religious icon out of the event. I remember the shape of the Pentagon, 9/11. And I remember wondering how come they made these so quickly? And there were just so many weird things happening, like masses of Arabs and Muslims being rounded up, immediate scapegoating. Again, part of this trying to sell the war on Iraq, trying to link 9/11 with Saddam Hussein, which, as I mentioned in my speech, they tried over and over again, and they tried to torture people into admitting this when it was patent nonsense, scaring people with the nuclear imagery of a mushroom cloud, again, trying to sell these wars. I mean, it was all about, and I guess this goes back to the quote by Graham McQueen, is that, if you could get Americans' blood to boil, that you can get them, if they're big patriotic flag wavers, you can manipulate them into doing anything. And this was just such a mass manipulation, and it was remarkably successful. And as you point out, I mean, it started with John F. Kennedy, and they've done it over and over again, with the scapegoating, with the RFK assassination of Sirhan. And that Lisa Pease has written a marvelous book, that totally breaks down why Sirhan did not do this. And the government have really become masters at propagandizing the American public.
Well, I think I'd be remiss if I didn't bring up in this context the most recent assassination on 9/11 of this month, Charlie Kirk. And anybody who is looking at what we've just been talking about over the years, this is the same kind of event, the same page out of the playbook. Uh, you look at what's happened to the country right now. There isn't anybody that is not talking about it. Millions have been traumatized. The graphic killing of Charlie Kirk in public in front of thousands and thousands of students and young people in Utah. And you see what's happening immediately, the division in the American people. Those who believed in Charlie Kirk, those who claim that he was not what he projected. There's lots of evidence that would link this killing to not Americans, but to Israel. And many commentators have pointed this out over the last couple of days. I don't believe that they're evil for pointing it out. I don't believe that they're spreading false news. There's enough credible evidence that Charlie Kirk has offered himself publicly that he went awry with the Israeli narrative, that he went awry and away from, my God, his wonderful friend in the White House, Donald Trump, who loved him like a son, when he started questioning Israel's grip on Trump in the White House and American policy. I just bring this up because I think for any objective person looking at these assassinations, one has to believe not the official narrative, which it was ready minutes after the actual assassination, and certainly in the 24 hours or so after that, the narrative had been set. Elizabeth. I don't want to comment any further on Charlie Kirk. I just wanted to put it into this conversation that it seems to be so similar. But I'd like to ask you this. Do you think that America possibly might come to recognize through all of these events we've been talking about the evil ways of their government and perhaps find a way to reconcile themselves, the American people, with each other who have been so divided over all of these instances, who have been so terrified for reasons and purposes that are disgusting and, in my opinion, pure evil. Do you think there's a chance for Americans to reconcile themselves as these things become more and more open?
You know, your question is so important, Regis, and at the same time, it brings to mind the very uncomfortable reality that the people that you mentioned that have been assassinated by our government, John F. Kennedy, Robert F. Kennedy, Malcolm X, Martin Luther King, and now quite possibly Charlie Kirk, were all people who were peacemakers and bridge figures. They were starting to bridge right and left. They were starting to bring the American people together. And there are powerful elites, powerful interests. There is Israel, all of those elements that would do anything to make sure the American people remain divided. And I worry that Charlie Cook was one of these people who, I'm sorry, Charlie Kirk. Apparently, back in January of this year, he turned down a large amount of money from Netanyahu. I guess he had taken money from Israel in the past, but this past January, he refused it. And I have that from good sources. And as you said, he had begun to speak out contrary to the Israeli agenda. You see peacemakers in the Middle East being assassinated. In Qatar, the people from Hamas that were negotiating peace. Again, I'm very concerned in this increasingly violent environment in our government that any figures that may try to bridge the gap between American right and left may indeed become victims of assassination in the future, or they will find other ways to silence them.